The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The fall and rise of socialism. How can this be happening in America? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. It's a secular version of the biblical phrase, "A child shall lead them," with fresh-faced 29-year-old Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez serving as the Pied Piper for Democrats who seem intent on reviving socialism. We will drill down today on the 100-year history of socialism and what socialism looks like today. A couple of our top authors at LibertyNation.com will join us. Andrew Moran will place socialism in a historical perspective and describe the full scope of socialist belief. And Joe Schaeffer will take a very different view that capitalism is clearing a path for the revival of socialism by laying the seeds of its own destruction. Plus, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin' Liberty as we examine threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. Well, green has been in the news a lot of late. Green for money, green for the Green New Deal, and green for marijuana. One top-tier candidate in a growing Democratic presidential primary field revealed his all-in position on the Green New Deal, and another said something which would have been controversial a decade or two ago, but not anymore. Senator Cory Booker, whose campaign rollout centered around race, loudly added himself to the chorus of advocates for the Green New Deal, which would turn control of the entire economy over to the federal government.
Our planet is in peril, and we need to be bold. It's one of the reasons why I signed on to the resolution, a co-sponsor of the resolution for the Green New Deal. And there's a lot of people now that are blowing back on the Green New Deal. They're like, oh, it's impractical. Oh, it's too expensive. Oh, it's all of this. If we used to govern our dreams that way, we would have never gone to the moon. We need to have dreams that other people say are impossible. We need to push the bounds of human potential, because that is our history.
Yeah, how silly to raise objections to spending tens of trillions of dollars and capsizing the entire economy for the sake of the federal government seizing control of everyone's lives. On the other hand, Kamala Harris let her hair down a bit in an informal discussion on the Charlemagne podcast and said she is definitely down with a different kind of green.
I know the answer to this, too. They say you oppose legalizing weed.
That's not true.
I know.
and look, I joke about it, half joking. Half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me?
They be so mad at you. Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay.
And I inhale. I did inhale. It was a long time ago. But yes.
I know you have to remember the high.
I do.
So if it was legalized all throughout the country and medicinal, would you do it?
Listen, again? I think that it gives a lot of people joy, and we need more joy.
I like the half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me? And I did inhale. She did at least sound human, didn't she? Booker and Harris will now have even more competition for the Democratic presidential nomination with the entrance of Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, the fourth woman to enter the race, and the official entrance of Pocahontas Elizabeth Warren. Klobuchar made it clear in her announcement that she's going after the voters in the heartland that put Donald Trump over the top in 2016.
Today, on an island in the middle of the mighty Mississippi, in our nation's heartland, at a time when we must heal the heart of our democracy and renew our commitment to the common good, I stand before you as the granddaughter of an iron ore miner to announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
Klobuchar, going for the moderate blue-collar vote, made that announcement in the midst of a driving snowstorm as she decried global warming, or climate change as it's now known. Go figure. Pocahontas, still haunted by her fake Indian heritage that she just can't seem to shake, made a play for headlines by saying that come next year, we won't even have President Trump to kick around anymore.
Every day, there's a racist tweet, a hateful tweet, something really dark and ugly. Are we going to let him use those to divide us? You know, here's what bothers me. By the time we get to 2020, Donald Trump may not even be president. In fact, he may not even be a free person.
Okay, so Pocahontas is saying Trump may be in prison stripes by the 2020 election, perhaps because she knows that's the only way she could possibly beat him. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, home of the black-faced governor and attorney general and the twice-accused sexual predator lieutenant governor, Governor Ralph Northam appears to have weathered at least the short-term storm of calls for his resignation and sat down for the first interview he's done since the multiple scandals began breaking and proceeded to define the early history of Virginia in a way that forced the CBS interviewer to intervene.
You know, if you look at Virginia's history, we're now at the 400-year anniversary, just 90 miles from here. In 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while
also known as slavery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hard to believe he could call slavery indentured servitude given all that's happened, but even more remarkable is how Governor Northam set himself up as a moral exemplar.
I'm a leader. I've been in some very difficult situations, life and death situations, taking care of sick children. And right now,
you're a doctor, yes.
Right now, Virginia needs someone that can heal. There's no better person to do that than a doctor. Virginia also needs someone who is strong, who has empathy, who has courage, and who has a moral compass. And that's why I'm not going anywhere.
A leader, a healer, strong, has empathy, courage, a strong moral compass. A lot of confidence there, but not a whole lot of humility from a guy who just embarrassed himself before the entire nation. We put a bow on Say What with another beaut from the mistress of over-the-top sound bites, consistent with the stated goals of many House Democrats to investigate this president every which way but loose. Maxine Mad Max Waters promised President Trump that she'll dig into his personal finances for sport.
You think I'm going to let you stand by? Someone who's done nothing but steal and lie and undermine. We're going to get your tax returns. We're going to find out.
Vengeance is mine, saith Mad Max. quick break, and then we'll dive into the history of socialism and how it compares with the socialism of today.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
truth
is making a
comeback.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Before you embrace or reject socialism, it's necessary to look at the history of socialism. It's no longer a theory. We've now witnessed more than a full century of applied socialism. It started with the Bolshevik Revolution that removed the Tsar and turned Russia into the Soviet Union, whose official name was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Over the decades, China, Cambodia, Cuba, North Korea, all of Eastern Europe turned communist or socialist. The documented death toll under communist rule over the last 100 years has numbered in the hundreds of millions. Andrew Moran of LibertyNation.com has written extensively on socialism. In fact, he's authored a 12-part series on it. And Andrew joins us now. Andrew, welcome to Liberty Nation Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate it. Now, Andrew, Nazism was forever repudiated after World War II, but socialism has never died despite the incalculable human suffering it's caused. How has the left succeeded in keeping this ideology alive and kicking?
Well, I think the Anointed have employed several methods to make sure that the socialism dream remains alive and well. The first, of course, is to resort to the old trope of, well, that's not real socialism, even though the country applied all of the socialist hallmarks, like nationalizing means production or applying production quotas and price controls. Of course, the other is to come up with some excuse as to why it didn't work. So I recently wrote a piece on Liberty Nation about how Venezuelan socialism, how the regime change in Venezuela will have the apologists blame that for why socialism didn't work. So as time goes by, the scholars will revise history and say something like, well, income inequality was eradicated, but if it weren't for the West imposing their will on Venezuela, it would have succeeded. And then the final one is just the manipulation of young generations. So since leftists control what everything the kids are taught in school, the children are indoctrinated with nothing but Marxist propaganda.
Well, now let's step back in history a bit. The atrocities of Soviet Russia and Mao Zedong's China have been documented over the years, although insufficiently by leftists who served as apologists for those regimes. But one of the most overlooked tyrannies of modern times was Pol Pot's Cambodia. Few people realize the genocide that occurred in Cambodia's killing fields in the 1970s. Describe what went on in Cambodia in the wake of the Vietnam War.
Well, first, I just want to mention that the socialists, there's something socialists never want to dive into, and I don't blame them, because Pol Pot, he was the diehard red Marxist-Leninist. He belonged to all the organizations. He studied the communist literature from Marx and Stalin, and then, of course, he helped establish the communist socialist parties in Cambodia. So when the communist forces took over in Vietnam after the war, right away he implemented all of the hallmarks of socialism. Private property was gone, money was gone, government confiscated lands, and he wanted his vision of a class of society to be achieved. And in order to achieve this, the government had to use force. So this resulted in villages being burned down, individuals targeted. People with glasses were the enemies of society. And then he founded the re-education camps. The killing fields is a crowning achievement. And there were, as the historians show, there were about 20,000 mass grave sites. And I'm sure you don't want me to go into how these people were executed. We'll just say that it was it was barbaric and something you'd see in the medieval times.
All right, so let's fast forward to today, where Almost all of Europe is engulfed with what's called democratic socialism, or soft socialism as it's termed by the left. How would you differentiate the so-called soft socialism we see all over Europe today from the murderous brand of socialism in the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong's China and Pol Pot's Cambodia?
Well, as I mentioned before, the argument fails if you understand what socialism is. So I'm guessing a lot of social proponents are banking on people not fully realizing what the ideology is. So, of course, socialists are always pointing out Europe as the beacon of what you can have if you have a socialist society because of its welfare state. But the literature of socialism's founding fathers portrays government takeover of commerce, getting rid of private property, eliminating interest, and you don't find this in Europe. I mean, you don't find something you read in Das Kapital or the Nazis' 25-point plan.
Now the left, and the right, as a matter of fact, are all now hot and bothered about this Green New Deal, which would require the government to end all air travel, abolish most cars, retrofit every building for renewable energy, and tear down and rebuild the ones who can't be retrofitted, and, of course, confiscate the wealth of the wealthy in order to guarantee a job and health care and a guaranteed income provided by the government for every American. Now, they call this socialist. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls this socialist, and she's a democratic socialist, self-proclaimed. But does the degree of government coercion necessary to implement all of this Green New Deal make this more communist than socialist?
Well, I think it was Ayn Rand who said the difference between communism and socialism was like choosing between murder and suicide. It always results in the same thing. So for me, it doesn't really matter if you describe it as communist or socialist. It all leads to the road to serfdom, to quote to Friedrich Hayek. Besides, I don't really worry about the Green New Deal. It's foolish. It's short on details. It appeals to emotions. It's not going to go anywhere. Her philosophy of facts don't matter if you're morally right illustrates how this thing was put together in the first place. Boy Booker is saying, the Green New Deal is like fighting Nazis, So I'm not too worried about the Green New Deal. I don't lose sleep at night over it. The world's ending in 12 years anyway, according to AOC. So what difference does it make anyway?
Yeah, you're using the language of Hillary Clinton. What difference does it make? Since the world's going to end in 12 years anyway, if we don't take radical action on climate change. Now, in Venezuela today, socialist leaders, and I don't think most people realize this, they've taken a nation with one of the largest supply of oil reserves in the world and turned it into a wasteland of poverty and corruption and violence. How can Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her rising generation of young socialists draw a meaningful distinction between what's happening in Venezuela and what would happen here if we embrace socialist programs like Medicare for All and even more so this new Green Deal?
Well, I think from when it comes to Ocasio-Cortez's point of view, it's all about marketing, and that's something she's excellent at. That's how she rose to political stardom. When it comes to others, they just ignore what happened in Venezuela and just dismiss it as, again, that's not what real socialism is. I was reading on a socialist website, the World Worker something, and they claim that Scandinavia is more socialist than Venezuela. And of course, we just debunked that myth, but it's still widely believed. And perhaps it's because people want to believe that socialism can give us a paradise and make everyone equal. So when you talk about government taking over an entire industry, like they did with oil, they'll also just talk about all the benefits and never any of the drawbacks.
Andrew, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Moran of LibertyNation.com. We'll take a quick break and then come back with a very different view of socialism and capitalism.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Why has socialism returned to respectability after it was seemingly repudiated when the Soviet Union collapsed into the ash heap of history? Why would we even consider such a philosophy with all the demonstrable pain and suffering and death that's been chronicled over the 100 years of socialist history? Well, Joe Schaeffer of LibertyNation.com says capitalism itself may be laying the seeds of its own destruction. And he joins us now to explain why. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate it. Now, when I asked you to do this interview on modern-day socialism, you wrote back, and I want to read what you wrote me and then have you expand on it. You wrote, socialism is coming back because so-called free market capitalism is screwing millions of people over. It's amazing to me that certain folks say capitalism should not be regulated at all, no tariffs, no antitrust, and then they wonder why people, especially young people, are attracted to socialism. Global capitalism has outsourced jobs, effectively eliminated borders so they could move cheap labor in, wiped out job security, pensions, and other benefits, destabilized communities, and depressed real wages over the last 40 years. If capitalists don't want 1789, the French Revolution, or 1917, the Russian Revolution, then they shouldn't act like elitist aristocrats with no regard for the, quote, peasants. Well, there's a lot of content in there. Could you expand on it a bit for us?
Well, I'll try. I write better than I talk, but I'll give it a shot. I don't want to take cheap shots at capitalism, but, socialism is just pure materialism. That's the evil of it. It disregards the dignity of the individual human being, his unique talents, his skills, what he has to offer. It's not brought to the fore. It's not cultivated because of this strict utilitarianism that just wants to take care of everybody. And, of course, it leads to a bloated state where the elites who run the state make off like bandits and everyone else suffers. How is this different from capitalism when you really think about it? This free market capitalism that has just had a death grip on the West for the last 30 years, especially America, it's pure materialism. It has no regard for the human individual. It regards him as just a worker bee, an economic unit. And the lower the cost to the corporation that he is, the better it is. So you're not valuing people besides you're just treating them as an economic unit. And I think most Americans realize today, this is why Trump won, I think, there is something fundamentally wrong with our society today. You see these stories all the time. 80% of Americans are not prepared for an emergency. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They've got about $100 in savings a month. Suicide rates are up 30% in the last 20 years. These are just headlines I picked out before coming here for this interview. We have major problems in this country. Jeff Bezos is worth $155 billion, and his employees are on welfare. Give some of that back, Jeff, or I don't want it to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. But, if the elitists just want to take it all for themselves and leave people hanging, they're headed for the guillotine. That's the warning of history. And I don't think you can overstate the problem. Americans are, if there is an economic downturn, things are going to get really ugly in this country.
Now, it seems to me that you're drawing a distinction between free markets and capitalism. Are you saying that free markets would work, but capitalism, as it's currently constituted, wouldn't? Or are you saying the reverse of that, or what?
I'm saying this slavish devotion to the economy under what's called free market capitalism. Basically, it's like a cult of the GDP. The economy is a tool to improve, all of our lives. It is not the end game. By worshiping GDP, by always thinking expanding GDP is the end all be all. Has it improved our lives? Have our lives improved in the last 30 years? I would say no. Massive immigration improves GDP. GDP rises with massive immigration. Massive immigration is destroying the social fabric of this country. Tucker Carlson had a very interesting monologue the other day where he said essentially that motherhood, women staying home and raising children, is bad for GDP. and women being single and working, worker bees in the factory is good for GDP. But I don't think anyone's going to say not having any mothers in this country is good for the country. So it can't just be about GDP. It can't be this fetish to the tenets of free market capitalism. You have to find a middle ground where you care about people, you care about society. Pure free market capitalism is just as damaging, in my opinion, as pure socialism.
Okay, that's a serious food for thought. But you're saying that capitalist overreach could well lead to an American government dominated by socialist policy. So what must capitalists do to turn the tide back in their direction?
They need to help support and boost a middle class. You can't just be thinking about lowering your cost per employee all the time, outsourcing jobs, bringing in cheap, often illegal labor. The end all and be all is not maximizing profits. It's okay to make a profit. I know plenty of rich people. They're good people. I'm not against being rich, believe me. But the idea that 400 million Americans can realistically hope to be worth $155 billion someday, that's not going to happen. A strong middle class is the best security for the wealthy class to protect them from a howling mob of socialists someday. And they're doing everything they can to bring about this mob of socialists, importing the third world when they don't have the values that we have as Americans. You can't just bring Mexico City, put them in Los Angeles, and think they're all going to magically become Americans. It doesn't work that way. So immigration is fostering socialism. The disregard for the worker is fostering socialism. But I'm not so much worried about what the capitalist elite wants to do. I think that the people the average citizen who sees it as a problem, what they need to do, stop giving your money to these people to the best of your ability. You can't do it perfectly. We're all in this society. But stop giving your money to Amazon if you can. Buy local, eat local, buy American, do anything you can to keep the money in your community. And I think that is the way that we can get over this global capitalism that is really tearing our country apart. We have to come together, the working class, the middle class, and we have to bring back a respect for the working man in this country. And I do think Trump wants to do that, and I'd like to see people on the other side of the aisle support him more.
Thanks for joining us, Joe. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is Joe Schaeffer of LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time for Talkin' Liberty, where we examine threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty with our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Well, we've been talking an awful lot about socialism today. Andrew Moran decrying the tyrannical history of socialism over the last century.
I join his cries, Tim.
But Joe Schaeffer coming in and saying that capitalism is largely laying the seeds of its own destruction, much like 1789, the French Revolution, 1917, the Russian Revolution. So here's a perfect opportunity for you to weigh in on the Green New Deal.
Well, I think it presents a massive threat to our liberties going forward. We can witness the Venezuelans starving today, and they don't come to power and promise starvation. That's not how it happens.
Right.
So how do we get to starvation from lofty goals of brother love and lifting everyone up? And how it happens is we eliminate the individual and the individual right to property, to due process, to freedom and liberty, and go with these collective values, and then nobody can have anything is what we can get. And so that, I think, is where the danger for the Green New Deal is. And I think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has the benefit of a unlimited supply of youth and charm and vibrance and vigor, and that makes her a very attractive legislator and political figure. But the ideas that she espouses will lead to that starvation.
I know your favorite Mazie Hirono, the senator from Hawaii, said she's
the bigot Mazie Hirono.
She's on board with the Green New Deal and didn't have an answer for the question of how you would take a train to Hawaii. But
you may actually make me a backer of this legislation.
That you'd never be able to come to the mainland again.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, the Green New Deal, we'll hear an awful lot about it in the years ahead. Well, really, in the months ahead.
It is a real threat, though, Tim. I want to make that point. It's not just, we won't have to pay more money to drive a car because of pollution controls or use electricity instead of gasoline to drive it. The changes and what would be required to implement those changes require across the board massive intrusions of liberty, seizing property, closing down industries, and all of the commensurate misery that will entail for the idea that this person knows what's all best for us and how society should proceed in the coming century, I guess.
All right, let's move on to the state of Alabama, which executed a Muslim inmate, Dominique Ray, after vacating a religious freedom stay. This is an intriguing story about the death penalty and the conditions that surround it.
Mr. Ray was sentenced to death for the murder of a young woman 20 years prior, and he got his date in November. So in November of 2018, the state said, we're going to execute you in February of 2019. He filed an appeal and he filed for to have this Imam Youssef Maisonnet, I think is how the man's name is pronounced, his spiritual advisor, and with him in the execution chamber. Christians are allowed to have ministers, Catholics are allowed to have priests, but the state, if you're not a Christian, you're sort of out of luck in Alabama. And so Mr. Ray said, it's my First Amendment right to practice my religion as I see fit. It's not some person who's going to aid in my escape attempt or something like that. We'll file all formal structures that a Christian minister would have to go through, but let them. Anyway, Alabama denied his request. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, Tim, said that Alabama was wrong or likely to be wrong, and they said, okay, you can't kill this man until we decide on whether or not we'll have a full hearing on the matter as to whether or not this man's imam gets to accompany him into the death chamber. The state of Alabama appealed that decision to the Supreme Court and said, let us kill him anyway. And the Supreme Court said that because Mr. Ray waited until late January to file this appeal, he was scheduled to be executed in early February, that it was just simply too late. That was a 5-4 decision to vacate the stay. And the minority belief, with the liberals on the court, said, as you might imagine, it's a man's life. What do we have to lose by staying the case? And I have to say that I find it to be quite troubling that in a matter in which there is no appeal from, you can't bring Mr. Ray back to life. Now, I can hear the victims' advocates out there saying, he murdered this young woman whose name I can't even remember, and that's true. And he also probably murdered 2 other people, if I read his background correctly, that aren't a part of this case. So it's not about whether Mr. Ray is, a sterling individual, but it's about, do we treat Muslims the same way as we treat Christians?
It seems like an innocuous request to have your imam instead of a priest or a pastor or a rabbi to accompany a man to his final resting place, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially when the state's killing him, which is to say nothing of the fact that, I don't know that there's a strong case to be made in this instance that Mr. Ray was identified for actual innocence in terms of his case, but there are strong factors that indicate that if he had a decent lawyer, he probably wouldn't. He may not have gotten the death penalty. I don't know about probably, but he may not. There are some. You start peeling back the onion on some of these cases, And what you see there is not a sterling example of what you and I might consider to be a robust process that led to the state putting a man's life to end. So there's two of those issues involved here. I think that going forward, perhaps we can see some recognition of Muslim rights. I don't think that they'll drop it now that there's no present inmate there. And also, future attorneys on death row cases, capital cases, will file these hopefully in a more timely fashion. But too late for Mr. Ray.
From Alabama, we moved north to Delaware, where the requirement for judges to be declared either Republican or Democrat is unconstitutional, according to a federal court. And I think this is very interesting because, Lady Liberty is supposed to weigh the scales in a fair and just manner. But the whole concept, we've had it for a long time, but the whole concept of a judge declaring themselves to be a Republican or a Democrat seems to be small d democratic.
Yes. Well, the interesting wrinkle is that this was designed to eliminate or help reduce the idea that one party would be able to rule because the state constitution requires this judicial candidate disclosure in order that there be a balance between Democrats and Republicans, which, of course, the problem is, as the three-judge panel in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals ruled, Tim, that it's an imposition on somebody's First Amendment rights to make them declare, if they want to be a member of the judiciary, that they are a Republican or a Democrat. And also, of course, it leaves out the fact that you could have people in the judiciary who are neither Republican or Democrat. And if they swore that they were, that would then be a violation of their oath. So with all that in mind, the court ruled it unconstitutional. I think, there are some jurisdictions where there are nonpartisan, judicial elections.
Right. And then people struggle to figure out what they really stand for.
And it's funny because this one is required partisan, judicial appointment and election. So it is interesting. And I think they made the right call here. Obviously, the idea that, our two-party system that's a colloquialism that we use. It's not enshrined in law that it's a two-party system. Right. And unfortunately, a lot of times, members of those two parties who are in power, to their own benefit, to the exclusion of other parties, continue to kind of put forth that notion.
It seems to me a good thing for democracy for voters to be forced to actually look into the background and the records of these people instead of just saying I'm automatically voting for him because he's a Republican or a Democrat.
Tim, that's the old style analysis. Now you just swipe a little bit on Facebook and see who's got whose puppy looks cutest and who makes the best Instagram pot meal.
Now let's move west to the state of Washington, where it appears that certain sheriffs are refusing to enforce new gun laws.
There was a statewide initiative approved by voters in November. It raised the minimum age for buying guns, required new background checks, and all kinds of storage requirements. Generally, it's sort of like post-Parkland style blanket, all hodgepodge of restrictions. None of which would have prevented, of course, that massacre from occurring, nor others, but that's not, sort of what moves the needle here. In any case, these sheriffs are saying, well, the case is being challenged. We think it may violate the Constitution, and until courts weigh in on this, we're not going to go ahead and enforce the law. And I think that it is really interesting that these sheriffs are taking it upon themselves to say, well, it's our role, too. We swore an oath not to do whatever the legislature says.
But to the Constitution.
Right. And we need to stand on our own judgment as to what that is.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio Plus, LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by me and Scott and Lisa K. Donner, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and, of course, from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.